In this parable, we look at the birds. And in the explanation, Jesus says the birds are Satan. I get pretty firm on the Christian response to aliens, immigrants. Throughout the New Testament, the gospel was preached in a hostile environment. The only thing we know is that the sower sows the word. We're faced with actually 6 soil types, not 4. Trusting the seed in your own life.
Welcome to the Impact Nations podcast with Steve Stewart. My name is Tim. I am your host, and this is Season 9, Episode 2, Nobody is Disqualified. Welcome to the Impact Nations podcast. My name is Tim. I am your host. This is episode 9-2, and today we are getting started in earnest on our series on the parables. Last week we had a great intro. If you missed that, just stop what you're doing right now. Go back, listen to episode 1. You have no business being here. You need to be in episode 1. If you've already listened to that, welcome to episode 2.
If you're getting like the oil change in your car, you can listen to it while they're doing that.
There you go. Perfect.
I just wanted to be helpful.
That's excellent. You can't get help like this just anywhere, folks. Hey, if you did miss last week and you're just jumping in and you're wondering what's going on, we are doing a series on the parables, and we're trying something new here. Dad's teaching, but I keep on interrupting him with pesky questions, and so we're going to try it again this week. This week, you are going to talk to us about the parable of the sower.
I am.
Where can we find that?
It's in the Bible.
Perfect.
I would, today I'm going to draw from Mark 4, which is the earliest of the Gospels, but you can find it in the Synoptics, in Matthew, in Luke.
All right. And are we going to talk a little bit about some of the differences between them, or are they pretty much exactly the same?
They're pretty well, but not quite.
Okay. I was feeling underworked, so I asked if I could read the passage this week, and then you can teach from that. So I'm going to read from Mark chapter 4, verses 1 through 9.
And I'm sure you're going to read very well.
I will read very well because I'm not attempting to read it in the original Greek. So here we go. Mark 4, 1 through 9. Again, he began to teach beside the sea. Such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat on the sea and sat there, while the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. He began to teach them many things in parables. And in his teaching, he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on a path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell onto good soil, and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And he said, if you have ears to hear, then hear. Then hear.
Then hear.
That's pretty straightforward.
So here we are.
Here we are. So I hope you heard.
In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all begin with the parable of the sower. And there are more parables developed, especially in Matthew. But for all three, I think it's very intentional. Not only is it one of the best known of Jesus' parables, but it's kind of the archetype for all the other parables that'll follow. And as we're going to learn through this series, there are different kinds of parables. I alluded last week, for example, challenge and riddle. But this is really a typical parable because it's about, we're back to what we said last week, the most familiar. It's about planting seed, sowing seed. It's crops, it's crop failure, it's fruitful harvest, all of that. And those are among the most common metaphors that Jesus uses for Israel. Remember, the vast majority of the population was agrarian, not only rural, but you'd have a blacksmith or you'd have someone but most people, they lived off the land.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a tough gig. I mean, we've all seen pictures of what the land is like, and especially what it was like before the whole restoration of the land in the last 50 years. It was not an easy way to feed your family and take care of things. So he taught, as I said last week, through parables that were everyday experience, that were completely common. Mark 4 is the original version because it's the first of all four of the Gospels. Yeah. And yet he only gives us, he says, and he taught them in parables, and then he gives us one. And why? I think it's because Mark is saying that this single parable of the sower it's a model. It's like a paradigm for all the others. And what will become really clear in the second half of today is Jesus is saying, if you understand this parable, you're going to understand all the parables. Our challenge is one of familiarity. We talked a little bit about that last week.
Sure.
And we're going to come smack into that today because we just assume that we know what the parable means. Anybody who's been in church for any time at all has heard teaching on the parable of the sower. And so the whole issue of mystery, of the unknown, of surprise, goes out the window if we read it with assumption.
Yeah. So can I just ask you real quick, because I think you've prepared a whole bunch of stuff here that is going to be really, really helpful for us. But imagine if we didn't have the Impact Nations podcast, and you're sitting down to this parable, and you're like, your brain is already in automatic mode. I know this parable. I've already heard sermons about it. Like, what's the first thing you do to kind of empty your mind and prepare yourself to take a fresh approach?
Well, the first thing I would do is what I hopefully usually do when I read in the morning is Holy Spirit come, and would you just illuminate?
Yeah.
I was teaching a group of people last night out of Ephesians 1 in the spirit of wisdom and revelation. Yeah. Revelation, you don't figure it out, you ask for it, and God gives it to you. But also, I would take the time to read it in the other synoptics. And are there any differences? Now, sometimes there are very few differences, but sometimes there's some fairly significant differences. The other thing is I would operate on the understanding that the elements in that parable are significant, are important. Remember 2-3 years ago, we went through Matthew, and we saw that there was every phrase, every word was there for a reason. And that's very much true of the parables.
Yeah. So slow down a little bit.
Slow down and stay open. Lord, what do you want to say to me? And then, for example, right away, in this parable, we look at the birds. And in the explanation, Jesus says the birds are Satan. You go, what? So does that mean Satan's flying around all the time?
I thought he was a snake.
Yeah. See? We tricked you. And he says the rocks aren't just rocks. They represent something else, which we'll talk about later, but temptations and so forth. The thorns are not just thorns. They represent other things that take us away and other desires. So the point here, and this fits in with your question, is the interpretation of this parable of the sower is largely determined by where our focus is. Are we going to focus on the sower? Are we going to focus on the soil, on the seed, on the harvest? And we need to consider all those things. And as you focus on one of those, it's really going to change the way you see compared to if you focus on something else, okay? Remember, I said to you that parables are just central in Jesus' teaching, and they're metaphor, they're filled with allegory, and it's like they're his primary mode of communication. Just like Old Testament prophets, a lot of the time you read, they would have heard, we read the Old Testament prophet, and we go, say what? And you got to dig deeper to begin to understand what they're saying. So I think that there's a real parallel between the parables and prophecy. The interesting thing about this parable, and remember I said it's an archetype for all the parables, is it's all inclusive. Nobody gets a pass because everybody falls. We're faced with actually 6 soil types, not 4. And we'll explain that in a minute. But see, I'll do anything to get people to keep listening. But everyone falls into one of those categories.
Yeah.
And also there's this inclusiveness again of using the motif of a field. Everybody, even city people at some point or other have walked by a field. Yeah. So it's meant to be really inclusive. John Chrysostom, and I haven't quoted him for quite a while, but one of my favorite church fathers, as you know, he said this: the sower makes no distinction between rich and poor, of wise and unwise, of slothful or diligent, of brave or cowardly. There's no distinctions made. This is for everybody. So there's some different options for interpreting this parable. The first thing is, I think one element is that Jesus is giving encouragement to these guys because they've, in Matthew's account, they've already gone out and come back and found out that although it's a beautiful gospel and it's great news, they also get run out of town sometimes. So he's giving them encouragement in spite of inevitable failures, and we're going to see failure in the soils in a minute. I think it also, this parable emphasizes the effectiveness of the gospel of the kingdom because ultimately there's going to be a good result. It focuses on the responsibility of hearing and understanding and responding. And we're going to see that especially in the second half where they ask for, hey, what does this mean?
Yeah.
And it's a parable of ultimate victory at the great harvest of the second coming. So those are some of the interpretations for me that I think can help us. And it is a mistake to overlook allegory. It's a mistake. We talked about this last time, so I won't belabor it. Yeah. But to just read things at a literal level, I think we miss an awful lot. So let's start looking at these different emphases. And we'll start, of course, with the sower. Yeah. In all the synoptics, it's the first one. That's for a very deliberate reason. There's more space given to Jesus explaining this parable than any other parable in the New Testament. And that's interesting too, isn't it?
Is that because the gospel writers, as you said, it's the first one, and so they're setting up like, hey, are they teaching us in a sense how to break down a parable, how to understand it?
Very good. Yes, they are. Yeah. That doesn't mean that Jesus didn't say all that. He probably said a lot more, right?
Sure.
We've said many times. I mean, John says if we recorded everything, couldn't fill the books would fill the world. But so absolutely, we're back to this is a story told by someone who heard a story told by someone else, right? Mark is telling his version of what he heard Jesus say. So, in this one, we talked about parable, the Greek word meaning a comparison. Remember we talked about a straight stick and a crooked stick. Mm-hmm. This is obviously moving beyond comparison. We're getting into much closer to a full-length story. Yeah. We're getting closer to what will later develop in like the Good Samaritan and the prodigal, okay? So, Jesus tells the parable. The disciples say, what does it mean? They never ask that in front of the crowd, right? Back in the green room, they say, what does it mean?
What on earth?
And Jesus then gives him a fuller explanation. So now let's look at the question, who is the sower? Yeah. Well, the only thing we know is that the sower sows the word. We're looking at Mark's version. Yeah. And here we go, an example of looking at the different authors, what they're emphasizing. Because Matthew says the sower sowed the word of the kingdom. Well, if you understand Matthew, of course he would have said that, because a huge emphasis in all of Matthew's gospel is the kingdom of God. He calls it the kingdom of heaven, just
Yeah.
so he doesn't offend the Jews, because he puts great stress on Jesus as the Messiah, as the coming one that Moses promised. And so he's always stressing the kingdom. Now, in Mark's version, which is what we're going with today, we see either that the word is the gospel itself, or the word is the capital W word. Jesus is the word.
So, all right. So let me ask you this, because just quick Bible lesson. Mark written 70 AD or ish.
Is some earliest would be 50, latest would be 70.
And John's gospel, which is where we get Jesus as the word, right?
Yeah.
In John's prologue, is coming
Somewhere around 95.
90. Yeah. So, 20 to 40 years later.
Yep.
Do you think that people were already referring to Jesus as the word, and John latched onto that, or because it's interesting to me that Mark's grabbing that all these years before John actually put it into writing?
That's a great question that I haven't given a lot of thought to. But remember, you made a point last session, which was really helpful, that sometimes the speaker, the author, says something that has got great prophetic significance and doesn't even know it.
Yeah.
And doesn't even know it. So this could be one of those examples. But, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God.
Yeah, and the Greek being logos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we go that way, the assumption in the church, all of my years listening to messages and probably the first 20 years of me teaching messages on this parable, is the Word is the gospel.
Yeah.
And we got to sow it. Well, maybe. But what if the word is the word, the logos word? And by this interpretation, Jesus isn't the sower. He's the seed. And it's the Father who sows Jesus into the world.
Wow.
And I think there's some huge implications, because this parable tells us that the seed was sown everywhere. Things, obvious places, and some places we go, what are you throwing it on a road for?
Yeah.
It's everywhere. And not just the places where we think we'd find Jesus.
Yeah.
You see, if Jesus is the seed, isn't that interesting? So the implications are really big. For example, for us at Impact Nations, you've had to listen to me say this for years, even before Impact Nations. When we would go into refugee camps, we would go among the poor, I would say to the team, we are not taking Jesus to this camp. He's already there.
Yeah.
And he's waiting for us. So it tells us he's already there, and what we're bringing is a beautiful gospel about the one who's already there.
Yeah, I was going to say, because what's our role? Because I think some people would actually read this parable and put themselves as the sower, like, oh yeah, we got to scatter the seed.
Absolutely.
Right? The gospel.
Yep.
If Jesus is already there, what is our role?
Our role is to go and connect with him in all the surprising places. And wherever Jesus is, people are. And our role is to give them an understanding. This is beautiful. He's already here. He already loves you. He's already moving in secret, unexpected places. Yeah. So that's the first point. The sower, I really have grown to believe it's Jesus is the seed, and the Father is the sower. Yeah. And that's quite a change, isn't it? The second thing is the soil. Now, I just surprised you when I said there's 6 soil types.
Indeed. Yeah.
Read carefully.
Doing some more of that kingdom math.
Yeah, read carefully. There's 3 types of bad soil.
Okay.
And there's 3 types of good soil. There's the 30, the 60, and the 100.
Ooh.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. All right.
See, we got to pay attention. We have to pay attention, especially on these really familiar passages.
Yeah.
So regardless of how we interpret who the sower is and the seed, the nature of the harvest, we've got to accept no matter how we interpret those other factors, we've got to accept that the only variable in the story is the soil itself. Because the Father doesn't scatter Jesus only to the good soil, he scatters everywhere, but there's different results, okay? So the first is, depending on your translation, it's either the road or the footpath. And I'm trying to not just go over obvious things here, right? We could talk about, what's hard ground, but the church fathers, we're back to metaphor. They saw spiritual significance in the footpath. One of the church fathers said this: "What is this path? It is the world into which we are born and which we pass through." It reminds us that we're on a journey, and this journey is universal. Everybody's on a journey. Psalm 39:12, "Hear my prayer, Lord, and listen to my cry for help. Do not be silent at my tears, for I am here with you as an alien, a temporary resident like all my ancestors." And of course, Peter emphasizes that like crazy, but it's emphasized in Hebrews, it's in the Old and New Testament, aliens. That's why I get pretty firm on the Christian response to aliens, to immigrants, to refugees, to asylum seekers, because of verses like this. So this is a theme throughout the Bible about aliens, but that we are on a journey. Again and again, it's written about in so many different ways. But as we walk on this journey, we got to keep our eyes on Christ, the one who said, "Lift up your eyes." So later, Jesus tells the disciples that the birds are Satan. Isn't that interesting? But we're going to get to another point on the road in a little bit when we explain. The rocky ground. Jesus is telling the disciples the reality that some will receive the gospel with joy, but without really considering the radical demand and impact. 40 plus years of ministry. I have watched this again and again, and it is always painful to anybody with kind of a pastoral heart. Somebody comes in with great joy, great enthusiasm. They don't miss anything. They're so excited, and then they just lose it, and they drift away.
Do you think that has anything to do with the gospel that's being preached? Is there a bait and switch here of, come to Jesus, you need a savior, get saved, and then later but he's also Lord, and he's to be Lord of your life, and that is going to require something of you. And suddenly you go, well, hold up, that's not what I didn't read the fine print.
And that to me is a very incomplete gospel.
So
that's one factor. There's another is just we are complicated beings. And when we turn our hearts to Christ, our hearts are also filled with pain and hurts and rejection and stuff that starts when we're toddlers. So it is the gospel that's presented, yes. It is also that we're about make a decision, not we're going to walk with you on a journey of discipleship. But it's also kind of the unknown factor of what's in us.
Because certainly there's times that somebody is being discipled and meeting with somebody regularly.
And they just fall away.
Yeah,
it's true. The stones, this is interesting. Jesus talks about the birds of the air, Satan. The church fathers believed that the stones in the stony ground are the sin nature that still remains in us. That if this is tolerated by us, we make excuses, that the enemy uses that, according to the church fathers, to snatch the seed away. I've been reading lately a superb book on the need for salvation at a kind of a deeper level, and the first quarter of that book deals with sin, not sins, but sin, the incredible power of sin, and within that power, our propensity to make excuses or to say, well, it's okay, it's not. The enemy uses that exactly. But they see, okay, in the stony ground, the enemy comes, but they also see hope in this example because of the promise in Ezekiel 36:26, I will take out of them the heart of stone. Isn't it interesting? So they're seeing layers.
Yeah.
It's never too late for someone to let God transform them. It's never a place say, well, I fell away, I blew it, I guess that's it. I'm disqualified. Nobody's disqualified ever.
Yeah.
One of the church fathers saw the rocky, stony ground as Jesus simply being realistic with challenging with believers. He says, what then is the ground? It is the sin nature that remains in the soul of the faithful who are still drawn toward the flesh. Their mind is from God, but their soul is from the divided will. Here's another part of the soil, which is the thistles and the thorns. But the cares of the age and the lure of wealth and the desire for other things come in and choke the word, and it yields nothing. Jesus is being really direct here. Let's go back to my friend John Chrysostom. Let us not place the blame on what we possess, but on our own corrupt mind. For it is possible to be rich and not be deceived, to not be choked with riches. For indeed, riches have two contrary disadvantages. Interesting. Number one, anxiety over riches, wearing us out and spreading darkness over us. And the other is luxury, which makes us soft. Yeah. He says, do not marvel at his calling our luxuries thorns.
Wow. That's so true. Yeah, because sometimes you look at folks who have plenty and they're still anxious about where the next one's going to come from. Like, oh, I got that deal done, but I'm already thinking about how am I going to get the next deal done.
Because deep down, there's a fundamental insecurity, the fear of not having enough.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how much you got in the bank.
Yeah.
Because it's not about how much you got.
Yeah.
It's what's going on in the deepest part of your being.
Yeah. My work, I get to interact with a lot of business leaders and things like that because we're inviting them to come and join the work of Impact Nations and become a part of this global family that is rescuing lives all over the place. And frankly, it takes capital to do that. And so we're talking to people with means who are able to help and come alongside and at times write some pretty big checks. And so I'm always intrigued by passages or quotes like that where how, we've got the classic passage of, easier for a rich man to pass through the eye of a camel to get into the kingdom of God. And yet I know many men and women of means who are all in for the kingdom.
Absolutely.
Where, how much is too much? Is there such a thing as too much? Like how do we make sure that those riches don't become thorns?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, that's a great question that we could just go back and forth on. Paul said to Timothy, it's the love of money that's the root of evil, not money. It's the pursuing something other than Christ and his kingdom. And all I know is we have to just check our hearts all the time. Paul did. He said, I had to learn to become content and comfortable in seasons of great want and in seasons of plenty.
Yeah.
So it is a process. I think I'm going to move on. I had another quote, but I think for time we'll move on. Let's talk about the soil types because we've kind of gone through these different pictures. The question that I'm thinking about these days is why is there the difference in harvest size? Why some 30, some 60, some 100? Is this about the individual's commitment to the gospel? Is it about individual capacity? Because we have to face the fact we don't all have the same capacity. Paul says we don't all have the same gifts, right? Or is it about a sovereign choice of God? So is it on him or is it on us or what? So we'll come back to that, but I just wanted to think about it. So the purpose of the parables. You want to read this part starting at verse 10?
Sure. One sec, I got to scroll down on my notes because I got distracted listening. Here we go. So this is starting in verse 10. It says, when he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may indeed look but not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. And he said to them, do you not understand this parable? Then how will you understand all the parables? The sower sows the word. These are the ones on the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. And these are the ones sown on rocky ground. When they hear the word, they immediately receive it with joy. But they have no root and endure only for a while. Then when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. And others are those sown among the thorns. These are the ones who hear the word, but the cares of the age and the lure of wealth and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, and it yields nothing. And these are the ones sown on good soil. They hear the word and accept it and bear fruit, 30 and 60 and 100-fold.
And there we have an interesting thing that I thought about that reflects this beautiful gospel that at Impact Nations we're so committed to. That he's already done it. Yeah. It's a free gift for everyone, but it requires a response. Yeah. And I think this parable, because it is the perfectly good gospel seed of Jesus that's on the road, that's in the thorns. And it's not about capacity, it's about response. Yeah. So here, I want to give you another example of reading for subtle differences between the three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Yeah. Because what you just read it's not for those on the outside to understand. Well, Luke 8:9, he says, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of God, right? Mm-hmm. But to others I speak in parables. He will never use exclusive language. Luke is writing to a Gentile audience. He's the most careful of all the writers to use inclusive language rather than in or out language that is simply a reflection of the Jewish worldview. So there's a little example of how there's some nuggets come as we read carefully. Okay, so we've read this parable thinking that the disciples were pretty thick. And I remember listening to a very famous and wonderful Bible teacher, but he went, man, if you want to be a disciple, you got to be dumb. I don't think so. That they were missing the obvious. Come on, how could you miss? This story's a piece of cake. Yeah. I can prove it. I've been listening to explanations of it for 35 years, right? But by and large, we're seeing Jesus say something pretty interesting here. And he quotes Isaiah, you will indeed listen but never understand. You'll indeed look but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing. That's a key word we'll get to in a minute. They've shut their eyes so they may not look with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Jesus is not condemning the Jews and the Jewish audience. Mm-hmm. He's not saying, you guys, you're so blockheaded. He is making a sad, painful observation of the state of the Jewish nation in the first century. It's like when he looked from Mount Olivet and he looked down on Jerusalem. And there were tears, I'm sure. You can hear the tears in his voice. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. How long I wanted to just hold you close and heal you, and you just wouldn't do it. You wouldn't get it. I think it's the same thing. He is warning them against superficial hearing, but there's no scold here. There's no scold. And he's saying that real hearing always leads to change of behavior. In fact, the Greek word for hearing has got that in there, part of the connotation. In fact, sometimes the Hebrew word is translated as obey. So the gospel always calls for a change. The word is metanoia. Let me just read you a passage from the book that is just being published right now.
Pursuing the Mystery of Christ, impactnations.com/mystery.
Oh, thank you. What was that you said?
impactnations.com/mystery. Get your copy today.
Here's just a little excerpt about this issue. Jesus is addressing a voluntary blindness and deafness. Some choose to continue in their hard-heartedness, which elsewhere Jesus calls out as wickedness, but not here. But even this passage presents the hope of restoration, that by changing their hearts they can be healed. Jesus quotes Isaiah to emphasize that the self-righteous do not understand. The word understand means so much more than comprehension or cognitive assent. The literal meaning is to stand under. That is, to be obedient to what Jesus is saying. True understanding always leads to a change of heart, of thinking, or of direction. The word's metanoia, which means repentance. That's how we know if we've understood, or the ones we're trying to teach, if they've understood. Is there a change? And so immediately Jesus contrasted the hard heart with the disciples. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. That's in Matthew's account. The parables are an open door and a gift for the innocent, for those who are receptive and prepared to hear and respond to Jesus' revealed light and let it change their direction and hearts. So even this parable is full of invitation. It's not judgment.
Yeah.
It's inviting. So, but this is a really big deal, these few verses where he quotes Isaiah in response to them saying, what is this parable about? And as I read through different commentators for their take, there were some real differences. I'm going to just give you an example. One, it says, this is not a condemnation, but a sad observation on the way things are. I tend to lean in that direction, as you could hear from what I said a minute ago. Yeah. And I mentioned John Dominic Crossan last time, who I theologically do not agree with on all kinds of things. But he makes some terrifically astute observations. He sees these words as some of the, and I quote, most stunning words ever spoken by Jesus. For some commentators, Mark seems to be saying that Jesus is increasing their incomprehension, so they can't hear. That that's what it looks like at a literal level. Yeah. It is counter rejection. If you reject me, I'm going to reject you. And this is a surprisingly common interpretation. I could list you several commentators who could go with that. But it doesn't make any sense, because Mark begins, before he tells the parable, he says he began to teach them. And Jesus opens the parable with, listen. And he finishes it with, those who have ears, let him hear. He's saying, folks, this is important. Listen up. Immediately after this parable, he tells the parable of the lamp. Remember, you put a lamp and then you put a basket over it. And that's just ridiculous. Just as a lamp is not meant to be covered, or it serves no purpose, likewise, parables that are intentionally obscure, what purpose do they have? Mm-hmm. So he says that just doesn't make sense that he would be doing that. And I tend to agree with that.
So again, I come back to, and forgive me if you've already given us this, but like, why does Jesus say to the disciples, hey, I'm going to give you the inside scoop on what this means? The others, all they get is what they
because I think he's calling them to metanoia. I think he's not calling the disciples to metanoia on this. Yeah. He's calling the crowd, you think about this. Yesterday or last week we talked about parables are about listen. It's going to change the way you think, the way you understand. And so he's using, once again, this time he's using Isaiah for rhetoric to say, well, but it's rhetoric. He's trying to make them see this is what we're up against to the disciples. This is what we're up against.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. Just one other thing, just while I've already interrupted you. Just a few moments ago, and in our last episode as well, you mentioned Crossan and said, this is somebody I don't actually agree with a lot of his theology and stuff. And yet it's interesting to me that you are still encountering his writings. And I think that for some of us, there's a tendency to, once we get a beat on an author, teacher, preacher, whatever, and go, you know what, I don't believe in what they believe or what have you, and we stop engaging with them altogether. It's interesting to me that you're still coming across some of his stuff. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that process? Like, how do you decide to keep reading his stuff and not just gloss over it, and then recognize when there's like something that really does resonate with you?
Okay. I think for me, some of that comes from the fact that I read a fair bit of scholarship. Mm-hmm. So it's not all or nothing with any author that I read.
Yeah.
I'm reading it in the context of other authors, plus my own things that I've written down. I think it's a great mistake to just say, oh, that's bad stuff, have nothing to do with it. I even refer fairly early on in this latest book to an episode once when I was in a coffee shop and I was talking with a pastor, a good guy, and there was a young man reading a particular contemplative author, and he looked over, he says, oh, that stuff's terrible, that's heresy, don't ever read that. And of course, the way I'm wired, I went and bought one, and I now have 10 of his books. And
Paul Young told us once that happened to him on a plane. He had one of his books with him, and the lady next to him said, "You're not going to read that, are you? I heard that's terrible, and all this stuff, and that's heresy and everything." And he's just asking her more, and finally she figures out she's talking to the author.
That would have been a great moment. So I think I read broadly. I purposely read from Protestant, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. I purposely read from 21st, 20th, and 2nd century through 8th century because I'm enriched by all of it, and I don't have to agree with all of it.
Don't have to agree with all of it, and I think it's funny, right? We're in such a binary. You've talked dualism, in, out, all these things. We're in a very black and white type of mindset so often, where it's assumed that, oh, okay, well, if you read that person's books, I guess you agree with every single thing they say, or you might even feel like you're supposed to. Like, well, I've read 3 of their books and I thought it was pretty good, but this 4th one, I'm like, I don't know if I agree with everything, and that has to be okay, doesn't it? Like, we have to just discern, okay. Like, this particular line of thought is not. And
if we say, oh, I'm not going to read that guy, then we'll never get any benefit. Yeah. I had a wonderful Bible teacher who was a mentor more than 40 years ago, and he said a book is the greatest investment there is. And I'm giving you 1980s prices. He said for $10, you can get the best of what God's taught somebody in a lifetime. And me, I love books, but I don't agree with everything. But I learn. Even where I disagree, it helps me think, why do I disagree? Yeah. Oh, because of this.
Interesting.
Okay?
Yeah, good. Sorry, I got you off track.
No problem. So the other thing about, that their hearts will be hard and so forth, how people respond to Jesus determines whether additional revelation will be given. And I've seen that, and you've probably seen that for years. When people just don't hear, they just don't get more. And when they're responsive, it seems like God gives them more and more. Okay? So I want to move on a little bit. I've got more than we have time for, but so Jesus is not talking about divine hardening or predestination. You get to listen, your heart's hard.
Right, yeah. It's been predetermined that you are rocky soil and there's no hope for you.
He's talking about human responsibility. Sure. We've got to take responsibility. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at a few other themes that are in this parable. There's a lot here, isn't there?
Yeah.
One is the universal work of the kingdom. This parable insists that the kingdom is always at work, everywhere for everyone, not some places and times, not some people. This was a huge challenge to the religious people, and it still is today to religion, that he's at work everywhere. It includes the whole world. No one is left out of the scope of this parable. The field is the world. Isn't that interesting? It says the field is the world. Now, the field is the world, and the field is Israel. Or the field is those who believe the right stuff, or whatever we want to fill in the blank. And this always makes religion suspicious, all the time. Yeah. Here's another theme: mystery. The parables and the cross. We talked a little about this last week. The seed is, of course, about smallness, right? The mustard seed's a classic example. And because it's small, it's easy to overlook. It's easy to overlook the mystery that's in the parable, the mystery that is in what Jesus is doing. Here's another interesting thing about the seed. Seeds disappear. If a seed still, I just put some seed out on my yard on Saturday. I've been watering each day. If it's still sitting there in a week, I know nothing's happened. Yeah. It's got to disappear. Jesus said, unless a kernel of wheat dies, it remains of itself alone. And it does its work. And even going back to Saturday, I put it down, and then I read, I got to rake dirt over it, right? The seed of the kingdom, Jesus, does its work in secret, in out-of-sight places and mystery, okay? So I wanted to just talk about that. Seeds are very small, but they yield massively disproportionately large yield.
We've got some farmland in Uganda, and they don't have sweet corn in Uganda. So we've got a farmer who's a part of our world here, a part of the Impact Nations family, who's actually providing a bag of seed for sweet corn in Uganda. It's going to be a big new thing. And he says, I'm going to send you enough seed for an acre. I was like, I don't have room for that, man. He's like, no, you don't understand. It's this tiny little bag. It'll fit in your suitcase, no problem, So seeds very, very small, and yet can yield some really big results.
And that's why I go back to what I said 40 minutes ago. We got to pay attention to the details. Yeah. It really matters. The images, the metaphor he uses. So the coming of the word may not look like much, but it does great work, and often it continues even in the invisible realm. And we know that in Impact Nations. Sometimes we'll plant some small seed because it's what we got, and we'll find out 6 months later, oh my word, look what they've done.
Do you think, like Jesus is teaching this parable in the Synoptics, he's teaching this parable right near the beginning of his ministry.
Yep.
Do you think he, in one sense, is there one layer where he's actually just talking about his ministry to come, like the next 3 years, what you've been expecting as the Messiah, which was going to be this big thing and it was going to be very noticeable or whatever, instead is coming as a very, very small thing, somebody easy to overlook. Isaiah says he wasn't much to look at. Like, this is not at all what you expected. It's coming in small. It's coming into the places that you wouldn't have expected. It's going to the people you wouldn't have expected to be. The field is different people than you thought. Do you think he's actually, in one sense, drawing some attention to the type of ministry he's going to have?
I think that's entirely possible. And it's another new thought. This is why there's no one meaning, one answer to Scripture, right? The seed, this is an interesting thing. I had always been taught and assumed that the seed was only working in the 30, 60, and 100. Yeah. Otherwise, it was wasted. But actually, the seed is always working. The differences in the 4 seeds is not about the effectiveness of the seed. They all bear the same power. And in fact, in the stuff that we thought was a write-off, it's feeding the birds. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? And in the next 3 types, we're seeing it do its work. It only does its work its complete work in the right conditions. But in every kind of soil, the seed was working. Okay? Even in the shallow soil, it's breaking it up just by having that.
Yeah.
It's God. God is always, always working. And I think that's a big part of this parable. You know, a greater crop comes when we're receptive. That's clear.
Sure.
But it doesn't mean the rest is just dead, nothing happened.
Yeah.
Stuff happens. I think that, let's move on a little bit because I am aware of the time. Hostility is another theme that's in here. Throughout the New Testament, the gospel was preached in a hostile environment. I mean, we just read through it. We see not only the religious people attacking, we see Mark 6, he could do no miracles because nobody even cared he was there and they didn't want him there. He taught them in Matthew 9 and 10, and if they kick you out, don't sweat it. Knock the dust off your feet. In other words, leave it behind you. Just move on. Yeah. Hostile ground. And throughout the New Testament, we see that, right? In the book of Acts.
Ephesus, that was a real piece of cake there.
Paul had a little bit of hostility. But it is an irresistible gospel. Yeah. It is when the enemy snatches the seed, it's rejected by a shallow response. It's choked out by the cares and the values of the world. But these things happen while the kingdom continues to do its work. And that's so important for us because, you know, I'm sure we've all had the experience of just being discouraged. Like, nobody wanted to hear. Nothing seemed to happen. But the kingdom is doing its work. We never know what's going on in people's hearts, for one thing.
Yeah.
So it's not the resistance that finally counts, not the resistance of the footpath or the stony ground or the thistles. It's the power of the seed, which is the word, the logos, and the gospel of the logos. That's all that matters. And it's interesting to me, really interesting, that the good soil didn't do anything. It didn't do anything. Yeah. It didn't help along the seed. This is getting interesting. It didn't say, well, we're just going to give it some help. We're going to do a little bit here. How does that apply to the 21st century Western church? Like, a lot of our strategies are to give the seed a little help. We're gonna have this thing and that thing and this thing to get people to come. We're gonna whatever. And I'm not knocking that. I've done those kinds of things in decades past. But what this tells me is the power is in the seed, right? You've heard me say that the authority is in the message. The power is in the gospel. And so I think 30, 60, and 100-fold yield, simply Jesus is talking about the mysterious work of God, the sovereign work of God. And yes, we're back to sovereignty and free will. I think the parable talks about receptivity. Or am I receptive or am I not? But it also talks about, it's so significant to me that there's 3 different yields that have got nothing to do with the soil. They all just were there to receive. So we've got both sovereignty and free will working together. And I think one of the points of this parable is we will find ourselves moving in rhythm and therefore of the kingdom and therefore enjoying its fruitfulness, or we'll find ourselves living not in rhythm, kind of beyond or even in opposition to the rhythm of the kingdom. And that does not mean whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, whether you go to church or don't go to church. There's something deeper about it, about trusting the seed, not just evangelistically, but trusting the seed in your own life. Yeah. I'm really looking forward to teaching on the parable of the wheat and the tares, because it's a lot to do with trusting the work of the seed in our own heart. So we'll bring this in close now. If we make limited responses to Jesus, to the word, i.e. the hard path, the rocky soil, the thorns, then we'll fail to become our truest self, our God-breathed self, who he made us to be. We'll just fail. Yeah. It's as we remove all resistance to the gospel, to the word, then we start to become our fullest selves, our fruitful selves, right?
Yeah.
John said, if you abide in me, you'll bear much fruit. And I think that's what's most important for us, to learn to abide. And it ties right in with what we've talked about, metanoia. And the last little thing about this parable, because it's so multi-layered, is we need to see it as prophecy. There is, of course, an individual application and responsibility. That's what we've been talking about all this time. But it also, like the Old Testament prophets in their words to Israel, where they're saying, wake up, Jesus is warning the nation not to repeat the failure of Israel, of their ancestors, the failure to hear and respond. And this is consistent throughout his ministry. He knew that an unrepentant Israel that was willing to live in the hardness of heart, the road, the rocks, the thistles, he knew what it ultimately would mean. It would be their destruction. Yeah. And that very literally happened within a generation. Indeed. So those are... And I'm happy for some question and answer.
I think my biggest question at the conclusion of this is, it's probably fairly obvious, but I think it's important to talk about it briefly. You mentioned it a minute ago a little bit in terms of metanoia, but the fruit, if it's going to bear fruit 30, 60, 100-fold, what is that fruit? How do we know that we are bearing fruit? How do we know when we ourselves have gone and scattered seed and brought the gospel to somewhere? What does fruit look like?
I think it goes back to again, we can externalize it and think of it evangelistically. Mm-hmm. We just finished hearing about a wonderful journey that's happening right now. Yeah. And there was incredible fruit. Maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. And so, yes, it's that. But it's, I think, very profoundly, Jesus is always talking about the heart. So we talked a few minutes ago, the word for hear really is hear and obey. Repent is change. So when we are responding with change, that is part of not only hearing, I think that's part of abiding. That's part of my life source, increasingly, is that seed that is Christ. Yeah. And he says, if you do that, you will bear fruit. And he also says, and you'll bear fruit that remains. Yeah. Now, yes, that could be that churches are planted, and that's wonderful. We love that. But it also means fruitfulness in my own heart that remains, that I am maybe more like Christ, more inundated in Christ now than I was 20 years ago.
Yeah. My hope is that after this hour, we have gone deeper and begun to see this from some fresh angles. But I think a lot of people have probably heard this preached from a very salvation-oriented angle, and so you'll hear debates on once saved, always saved. No, but the birds can come and steal, or the thorns can choke it out, and then you're not a Christian anymore because you lost your faith.
And I got a proof text to show it.
Exactly. So I wondered if you could just speak to that briefly. Have you heard this text approached that way? Did you once understand it that way?
Absolutely. From my background, which was theologically fairly conservative, there was no other way. That you're going to preach the gospel, and some people won't even hear it, and that's on the footpath, the road. Mm-hmm. We say road, it's actually footpath. And there's others that are going to hear it, and they're going to get all excited, and you're going to think something great's happening, and then they just fall away. it's all, that was the only way I ever heard it presented. And it was, again, it was all up to us. You see, salvation, it's up to me if I will believe, if I will accept, if I will, rather than it is this irresistible gospel logos Jesus seed that does its work in obvious but also in very hidden ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. My wife Bethany, I've heard her speak with people who in no way would identify as Christians, as Jesus followers, and yet she's always calling out the Imago Dei from them, and she'll just say like, you resemble. I see Jesus all over you. Like, man, your kindness, your compassion for others, whatever it is. Like, she's calling that out, and I'm just reminded, as you say, like, if the seed is Jesus and He is there, He's already waiting for us. Our job ultimately is just to, can you see Jesus is here? This is amazing.
Yeah,
and it's always interesting to me to see the response of people who are like, really? What? This is news to me. I didn't know this.
Yeah.
I've never heard anybody get ticked off at her and say, well, I don't follow that Jesus. I don't know anything.
No.
They actually resonate with it quite quickly.
Because it's truth.
Yeah.
He is the way and the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been fun. I do want to tell people about it. I was supposed to interrupt you partway through, but I was too engrossed and I forgot. But I need to tell people that today's episode brought to you by Journeys of Compassion. You hinted at just a second ago, just before we came into the studio today, we were getting a report from a journey that's happening right now in Malawi. I don't know when this episode is going to air, to be honest. So the journey is wrapped, and you should go check out our website for all the stories. But I mean, day one, we're hearing stories of a whole lot of healings.
Our three leaders did a Zoom call with me, and they said there were too many, not just healings, there were too many blind eyes that were open for us to keep track of it all. And the same with deaf ears.
Yeah.
And then one of them said with great joy, there was a 3-year-old, a crippled 3-year-old who was brought in and who's now walking.
Extraordinary.
Isn't that good stuff?
That's wonderful. I bet you'd like to be a part of something like that. So if you have not been on a journey of compassion, or maybe it's been a few years since you were on a journey of compassion, I want to invite you to come join us. If you head to impactnations.com/JOC, stands for Journey of Compassion, you can learn about some of the upcoming journeys. I know Bill's got one in the works for Colombia in January, looking to get something done in Mexico, in Tijuana, in the summer. And then I think we're going to Uganda next year as well. So lots of opportunity to go and just be right in the thick of what Jesus is already doing, and helping people just see that the kingdom is already among them, and help them wake up to the fact that they were made for kingdom life.
Yeah.
So come check it out. Impactnations.com/JOC. Register for a journey. By the way, I know that's scary, but we've got you on a number of different fronts. I mean, for starters, you're going to get some awesome training. We've got training videos that we do not just on your own, but together. Like the whole group gets together. Once everybody's registered, we get together on Zoom and we watch training videos and then have time of discussion and wrestling with some of the material. And by the way, that includes super practical instruction too, like how to pray for somebody. You know, we talk about the importance of saying, "May I pray for you?" But then actually, you know, if somebody says yes, what do you do then? Well, we've got a whole video on how to do that, how to pray for somebody and see God come and heal them. And then even financially, we've got amazing tools to help you fundraise with your friends and family. Tell them all about what you're going to be doing, and they get to join you by giving generously to help you get it done. So check it out, impactnations.com/JOC. Come play with us. We're having so much fun. We're seeing God come and bring forever transformation. I mean, honestly, like blind eyes open. Those are lives that will forever be changed because their whole reality just is completely different now.
Yep.
So anyway, This is the Impact Nations podcast. Thank you for being with us. We are just getting started in our season 9 on the parables. There's loads and loads of back catalog, by the way. If you're new to Impact Nations, maybe you want to check out all of the series before. This is season 9, so there's lots of material there. But we are on YouTube every Thursday. I don't know what time that happens, but every Thursday we're on YouTube. So be sure to subscribe, hit the little bell so you get the notifications, or subscribe to the audio podcast on whatever app you like to do for your audio, and that'll get delivered to you right away. So we're going to be with you again next week. In the meantime, have a good one.
God bless you.